Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I have a new baby card to share with you using the I'll Love You Forever set. So let's get started. First of all, I've taken a panel of white cardstock that is cut to 3.75 inches by 5 inches, and I'm using the Piece of My Heart Dynamics, and I'm going to cut that from the panel. So I'm just working out where the middle of the panel is. Not necessarily the height, but the width, and I'm just going to draw a faint pencil line just so that I can line up that die. I want the heart to be in the middle towards the top of the panel, and because hearts, you can notice when they're not quite straight, that pencil line is just going to help me out so that I can make sure that that heart is straight. Once I'm happy with the placement, I can place some low tack tape on top and run that through my die cutting machine. This is such a lovely die. It cuts out lots of little pieces of the heart that you can kind of put back together, and you can cut it from lots of different colours of cardstock and things. I actually just wanted to use this die to create a window from my panel, however, so I'm just using the negative part of that die. And my idea is that I'm going to have some cute little animals inside of the heart. So this is the I'll Love You Forever stamp set, and I'm just figuring out here which animals I wanted to add inside. Because these images are in a square, they're not all going to fit inside of this heart, but those bears fit in perfectly, so I'm going to use those. I'm going to stamp the image down onto some white cardstock, so I'm just placing it in my mini Misty here, and because the images are square, I'm going to fussy cut the image out, but I wasn't sure if the lines, which would be on the left hand side when it stamps, on the right hand side on the camera here, I wasn't sure if they were going to kind of impede the image slightly, so I'm just going to cover those up with some post-it tape so that when I add the ink on top and ink up this stamp, the ink isn't going to get on that part of the stamp. You want to make sure that you remove that post-it tape before you stamp down. I have actually done that on a few occasions, left the tape in place, but it's never helpful. So I'm just going to remove that and then stamp out that image, and as you can see, those lines on the left hand side have not stamped. I am just going to double stamp that so that I get a really nice dark impression, and then I'm going to colour the image with Copic markers. I'm starting off with my darkest shade here and just adding in the darkest shade where I think the darkest areas would be on this image. So for me, I feel like it's in the bottom kind of left hand side, which will be towards the bottom left hand side of the heart. So I'm going in with my darkest shade here, which is the E59, and just adding that, like I said, all along where I think the darkest areas would be. The bottom left hand side of this image actually does get cut off quite a bit by that heart, but while I was colouring this in, I didn't actually know that, so I didn't really need to colour this all as I did, but you never know when you're colouring images how they're going to end up on your card. So I'm now going in with the E57, and I'm just blending that darker colour out and pushing the colour more towards the image. I'm then going to go in with the E55 and blend that out further. This colour here, the E55, is quite a bit lighter than the E57, so it does take a little while to kind of blend those two shades together. I find with Copic markers, the more you layer up the colour, the better the blend you get. So I'm kind of just blocking in that colour to start with, and then I'm going to go back in with that E57 and add a little bit more onto the image, and I'm kind of just flicking that colour upwards, and I find that that helps with the blending as well. So now when I go back over with the E55, that does blend out quite a bit nicer. I then do want the top of the bear to be a bit lighter, so I'm going to go in with the E53. Now the E53 is a little bit of an odd colour in terms of Copic markers. As you can see, it's quite a bit more on the pink side compared to the E55. So I'm trying to do the same trick that I did with the E57, kind of flick that E55 back up into the E53. But the E53 is very odd in that sometimes when you try and blend it with the E55, it turns the E55 into more of a green shade. It's very, very odd. Sometimes it does it and sometimes it doesn't, but I found that it was doing it on this image. So I've now added the E57 kind of underneath where that baby bear is, and I'm just going to go back over the whole thing with the E55. So it's not going to be much lighter at the top where I wanted it to be, but I am going to get a nicer coloured image than I had. I apologise that my camera kind of cut off here and it did zoom out and I didn't realise, but I'm just colouring in the baby bear the exact same way that I coloured in the larger bear with the E59, E57, E55, and then with this one, because it is a smaller area, I do go in with that E53 and it didn't go green this time, which was a lot nicer. I do go in with the R12 to colour in their ears. I'm sure that bears' ears probably aren't pink in real life, but they do look quite cute on the image. And then for their snouts, I'm using the E55, the E51 and the E50. I wanted those to be quite a bit lighter than the rest of the bears. So I'm just going to go back in, do the exact same thing, and I do add a little bit of the E53 here just to kind of blend that out a little bit more. And then for their noses, I'm using E49. I'm then going to fussy cut the bears out, and what I like to do when fussy cutting is to try and keep the scissors as straight as possible and try and move the cardstock, and I find that I get a better cut that way. The only thing is I do have to have the cardstock and the scissors about 3 inches away from my eyes, otherwise I do find fussy cutting quite difficult. So I did have to cut that out of the video and I do apologise for that, but I just took my time to go around the image and left a small white border. I'm then just going to bring in that panel again just to cover that over, just so that I can see where that image is going to sit inside. I've then taken an A2 sized white card base, so this is a 4¼ inches by 5½ inches finished size, and it is folded at the top to be a top folding card base. I've placed my panel on top and I'm just going to use a pencil to go around the inside of that heart, and this is so that I know where I'm going to add the ink blending inside. I thought that I would add ink blending, but you could use patterned paper or something like that. Because I'm doing the ink blending directly onto the card base, I do just want to mask off all of the edges of that card base so that I don't get any ink blending onto them. I'm just going to erase that pencil line and then I can add my ink inside. So I'm going to start off with the Blue Yonder Premium Dye Ink Pad. I'm just adding some of that ink onto an ink blending brush here, and I'm going to focus the majority of the colour towards the bottom left hand corner. That's where my images are going to be inside of the heart. So I'm kind of, like I said, focusing most of that colour and sort of blending up lighter towards the top right hand corner. As I was blending this, I did think it was a really nice colour, but it wasn't quite the look that I was going for in my head. I wanted a slightly brighter blue, so I'm going to go in with the Cornflower Premium Dye ink and add that over the top. So this is that ink here. I am using the old formulation of ink pads. They do have new ones now. I just haven't managed to get my hands on them yet, but they are the same colours. So I'm just adding, again, focusing the majority of that colour in the bottom left hand corner and blending that up lighter as I go. I am going to bring in my panel halfway through so that I can see where, if I want kind of any darker colour to be, and I did think I wanted it quite a bit darker in that bottom left hand corner. And then once I was happy, I can remove that memo tape, and it's going to look absolutely awful because I didn't make sure that I taped it straight or anything like that. But once I add the panel on top, you're not going to be able to see that. And my little bears are just going to pop inside of that heart. I just think they look so cute inside of that heart. Next, I'm going to work on my sentiment. This is the Itty Bitty Basics stamp set, and I'm going to use the sentiment that reads "Welcome Little One." I actually want to stamp it on 2 lines, so I'm going to do some masking of the sentiment. I'm first just going to take some black cardstock. This is black licorice cardstock. I'm just prepping that with an anti-static powder tool and removing the excess powder. And then I'm going to mask off the words that say little one so that I can just ink up the portion that says welcome. So I'm using a Versamark ink pad here, which is a clear sticky ink, inking that up really well. Again, making sure to remove that post-it tape, and then I can stamp that down onto the black licorice cardstock, and that's just going to stamp that welcome sentiment to start with. I can remove that from the MISTI, and then I can add another piece of black cardstock in, making sure that I'm just keeping that sentiment where it is, although it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this because I'm not making sure that they're in the same place. I want to make sure that I'm cleaning off that stamp because it does have that sticky ink on. So I'm just using a chamois there and my finger just to dry that as best as possible, and then I can cover over the welcome sentiment and then stamp out the little one. So again, just inking that up really well with the Versamark ink, removing that post-it tape, and then I can stamp that down onto another piece of black licorice cardstock. Just pressing down lightly, and then I can add some embossing powder onto these panels. So I'm just using some white detail embossing powder, just adding that onto the panels, tapping off the excess. And then because of the nature of stamps, even though I didn't add any ink onto that side of the stamp, it was actually completely clean and dry. It does just grab hold of that embossing powder, so I'm just using a dry brush there just to remove that embossing powder, and it's doing the same thing to this little one sentiment here as well, but I can just remove that quite easily with that dry brush. I'm then going to heat set the sentiments until they're completely melted, making sure not to overheat that embossing powder. So just moving that heat gun as soon as it's melted away. And then I can cut those sentiments down into strips, and I'm using the Itty Bitty Strips Dynamics set. I've got 2 of the strips here, and then I've run those through my die cutting machine, so that's going to cut each of those sentiments into strips. I'm then just taking my mini guillotine here, and I'm just going to cut those down on either side of the sentiments. I have my bears inside of the heart panel, and I've added some post-it tape to the front just to hold them in place, and then I've added some thin foam tape onto the back of the image piece only. I'm then going to place that over the card base, and then once I've lined that up, just taking my time to line that up, and then I can press that down, and that's going to stick the bears down onto the card. I can remove that piece of post-it tape, and then I can add some foam tape onto the back of this panel. And for this panel, I'm just using normal dimension foam tape, but I've also added a little bit of the thin foam tape where it overlaps that image of the bears. So that is going to be 2 layers of thin foam tape high, and the rest is just going to be 1 layer. I'm using some glue stick here to run that over the back of the panel, and that's just going to give me a little bit of extra wiggle room just to make sure that I'm going to adhere this panel on straight. Taking my time here just to really line those up, and then once I'm happy I can press down. I'm then going to add my sentiment strips on top. So I've added a small amount of foam tape onto the left hand side of the sentiments, and then I can use some tape runner on the right hand side where it's going to overlap that panel. Using my T-square ruler here just to make sure that I add those on straight. And I think it really balances out that heart shape with the sentiments in the top right hand corner and the image in the bottom left hand corner. I'm just adding some clear glaze pen onto the noses of the bears, and then I've also added some black glaze pen onto the eyes, and both of those are just going to make them pop and just add a little bit of shine onto the card. I really like how those bears just kind of pop out of the heart, and I think it works quite well for a new baby card. Really clean and simple. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description box on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.